If you'd like to go ahead and get your lesson books out, we're in Lesson 7. Lesson 7 on page 13. And last week we finished up Lesson 6, so we haven't actually gone into Lesson 7 yet. So we're right at the beginning. Jim, did you want a book? Do you need a book? Okay. They're just right around the corner on the shelf. Okay. So we are in 1 Samuel chapter 18. If you want to get your Bibles out, we'll be reading from there from time to time here. 1 Samuel chapter 18. And just as a reminder, last week we were finishing up the story of David and Goliath. So I think everyone's pretty familiar with that, so we don't really need to spend much time on a recap there. But in 1 Samuel chapter 18 is where we're going to be. And we're going to kick that off by talking about David and Jonathan. So let's go ahead and read verses 1 to 4, and then we'll jump into our questions. 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 to 4, it says, "Now it came about, when he had finished speaking to Saul, that Jonathan committed himself to David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. And Saul took him that day, and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped off his robe and gave it to him, to David, with his military gear, including his sword, his bow, and his belt." So question 1 says, describe the friendship of David and Jonathan. Who wants to? Yeah.
Could you tone that down a little? It's really loud.
Oh, is it too loud?
I don't know how. I can step away from the mic, but that's all I can do.
Was the other one too loud?
We'll get that sorted out. While Rick's doing that, who wants to go ahead and take a shot at describing that relationship? Yes.
The English Standard Version says that their souls were knit together. I think yours says they were committed or something like that.
Yeah, so I'm reading from the NASB, and mine translates that phrase as committed. It says Jonathan committed himself to David.
They were close friends, close bond. They loved Jonathan loved David as his own soul. They had a covenant, and he gave him his robe and his armor, which is kind of tantamount to, Jonathan is the king's son, and so some of that might represent kingship or princely heritage.
Real quick, is this any better at all with the mic? Still too loud? Do I need to step back more? Better? Okay, good. So those are all great examples. Another way to think of it sometimes is how would you describe it in modern day terms, right? If this was not way back in Israel, how could you describe their relationship, right?
He loved him like a brother.
Loved him like a brother. You could say they were BFFs, right? They were besties. They were best friends. They loved each other as brothers, right? There's a couple different ways you can do that. And all the things that Jonathan does here are symbolic in that closeness. So you mentioned he's giving him his armor and stuff, and that's more than just a gift. It really is. Those are things that belong to a prince. That is princely raiment. And by him giving it to someone who's of not royal blood, you're really giving them an honor. You are honoring them and saying, like, you are equal to me. So that's a big deal and shows what high regard Jonathan has in David. So all good answers.
I had a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
When it said he took off his robe and all the other things he gave to him, it made me think of the prodigal son and the father.
How so?
Well, how he took off his ring and he gave him his coat, and he just honored him. He loved him. And he wasn't, coming back to him because he was lost, but he just showed such a love for him.
Yeah, there are many times when great affection or love is revealed by the giving of a gift. I don't know if any of you have ever read different relationship books, but there's this idea of that there are different love languages, and there are ways that people express themselves to one another. And some people are better at one than they are others, right? Some people are gifted with words, and they can express their feelings very well with words to someone. And so their love language is words. Others, it's actions. Like, I went and I did something for you, like I cleaned the whole house while you got to sleep in, and I made you breakfast in bed. They express themselves through actions. And others, it's gifts. And so being able to give a gift of great significance or symbolism to someone is another way that people can express their love for one another. So question 2. Question 2 says, when you consider what has been shown about the mind of Jonathan, and this refers us back to chapter 14, so we'll get back to that in a second. In the mind of David, chapter 17, do you find this friendship difficult to understand? Now, if you remember a couple weeks ago in chapter 14, this is where Jonathan, not fully by himself, but with the aid of one of his aides, they go and they scout out the lands because Saul is not doing anything in this battle. And he goes out there and says, let's see what we can do if God wants us to do this. And so he goes out there and he prays to God for a symbol to make sure he's not just kind of going off on his own, and God grants him that. And it leads to several victories for Jonathan. And David, it's referring us back to the story of David and Goliath. So with those two stories in mind, it asks us, do we find that friendship difficult to understand and then explain? What do you think? Kim?
I think both of the men are righteous men, and they love the Lord, and they also were both men of action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many friendships are built on a common ground, right? Some connection with one another. So maybe you form a friendship because of where you go to school with somebody or the neighborhood you grow up in. You have something in common, some common ground. And when the foundation is God's word, it's even stronger, right? What better foundation could you build any relationship on than God's word? You know that what's built on that's not going to crumble away. And so the both of these men, we see through their actions that they're very willing and able to put their lives on the line in how they trust God. And so they recognize that in one another. Matt?
When I first read this question, I wasn't sure why he was asking the question, because I guess I'm just so familiar with the story that I even know a man named Jonathan David. He goes by John David because those names go together, and that's like almost like a symbol of friendship. But as I looked at those chapters and their warrior status, I think it's perhaps the idea that great warriors tend to be very competitive, and so for them to be friends rather than competitive, and even again for Jonathan as the prince to give some of those things to someone who may be a challenger, that's just completely against the way it normally works.
Well, and you're right. When I read this question too, like I had a little bit of difficulty understanding what the author's going for. It's almost like he's trying to trick you. He's asking a trick question. Is it difficult to understand? Well, the answer is no, it's not. They have a very similar thing in common. I sometimes think that the author of this particular book, the way he words questions, sometimes you're wondering what he's going after. Sometimes he asks them in a very leading way, so you know exactly what he's looking for. So just his personal writing style, I think, is showing through on this one. But yes, so all the things that we've said so far, all of those, I think, explain how that relationship was able to come together and shows the similarities between the two. So any other thoughts before we continue reading on here? So the next section, actually, it goes from chapter 18, verse 5, all the way into chapter 19, verse 10. I'm not going to read all that in one chunk. I'm going to read a couple verses. We'll tackle a couple questions, and then we'll continue reading. Otherwise, you're going to start to fall asleep with me reading at you the whole time. So we'll start in verse 5. And let's see, I'll read down to verse 9 to start, and then we'll go from there. So chapter 18, verse 5, it says, "And when David went into battle, wherever Saul sent him, and always achieved success, so Saul put him in charge of men of war. And it was pleasing in all the sight of the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it happened, as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine," that's Goliath, "that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with other musical instruments. And the women sang as they played, and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this lyric displeased him, and he said, 'They have given David credit for 10,000s, but to me they've given credit for only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?' And Saul eyed David with suspicion from that day on." So question 3 says, describe David's growing fame. Guess it's not really a question, is it? Describe David's growing fame. It's more of a request.
He was
Being
favored
very
by the
successful.
people.
Yes, I think you two said exactly the same thing, pretty much. He's very favored by the people. He's gaining popularity. He's becoming a minor celebrity, right? They're singing, they're dancing, they're making songs about him. So all of those things. Now, question 4 says, how does Saul's hostility towards David begin?
Well, I summed it up with one word: jealousy.
Okay.
Envy.
Jealousy, envy. I actually wrote down pride. I think all those connect together. Matt?
But pride connected with the songs that these women were
Right.
saying, well, Saul's great, but David's so much greater. And
Right.
I didn't like that.
Yeah, the underlying fault, the jealousy, the envy, the pride, that ego in Saul, that was there, but it was really the song lyric that kind of bubbled back to the surface. You know, that was the trigger for Saul. And it was basically that he felt slighted. Now, verse 5 kind of asks us to go into a little bit of a deeper dive here. It says, explain how Saul's question in verse 8, we'll get to that in a second, is related to chapter 13, verses 13 to 14, and 15, verses 26 to 28. So we have a few things to go back and forth to here. So first of all, the question that Saul asks. Saul asks, now what more can he have but the kingdom? That's the question Saul asks. Now, what the book refers us to, if you want to first turn with me over to chapter 13, turn back to chapter 13. In verse 13 to 14, it says, but Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For the Lord would now have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Okay, so that's what Samuel said back in chapter 13. Then in chapter 15, in verses 26 to 28, chapter 15, verses 26 to 28, Samuel again speaking, he says to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. Then Samuel turned to go, but Saul grasped the edge of the robe, and it tore off. So Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to your neighbor, who is better than you. Okay, so with all those little passages in mind, explain how Saul's question of what more can he have from the kingdom, how is that related to them? Rick?
Well, Saul knows his time is numbered. If he paid any
Right.
attention to Samuel at all, then he knows he's on a limited time frame. He's basically fired and just waiting for his replacement.
Right. So go ahead.
Sorry, I think he
that David is going to be the next king. I think that's
Yeah.
the reality that is coming to right now.
I think, well, right after that, it says, and he was suspicious of David from that day, right? So I don't know if he's 100% there yet, but he definitely suspects it, right? So he knows from based on what Samuel said a couple times to him that he is going to lose the kingdom. And especially in that very last verse that we read, it says God's giving the kingdom to someone better than him, right? So Saul remembers that, and they're saying that David is better than Saul. He's killed more people. He's conquered more, right? So Saul's starting to put some pieces together and connect the dots and think, what if this is the guy that Samuel was prophesying to me? What if this is him? So now he's watchful of David from that lens. Before, this was a servant of his who eased his mind. He solved this quite literal giant problem that Saul faced, right? He fixed a lot of things for Saul, and he brought good stuff to Saul. But more than just provoking Saul's jealousy, now Saul is starting to be suspicious of him as a rival for the kingdom. Okay. So question 6 says, trace the development of Saul's attitude towards David so far as it manifested in these verses. We've kind of done that a little bit. What I wrote here is that not just these verses, but over the story that we've read so far about Saul, everything we know about Saul since when he's been appointed, since he met David. If you start out in 1 Samuel chapter 16, when he meets David and David's his musician, it says he loved David and he favored him. So when they first meet, when Saul is first introduced to David in any capacity, he loves him and he favors him. He's the musician who eases his mind. In Samuel 18, verse 5, shortly after David has taken care of Goliath, it says he trusts him, right? He has trust in David because he's sending him out to lead his armies, not just like a couple guys, but like big regiments. He's commanding Saul's men and Saul's army. Saul's putting a lot of trust in David. So it goes from love and favor to trust. And then we get down to the song where it becomes anger and suspicion. It quite literally spells out that Saul is angry about it and then suspicious about it. So we can kind of see how David starts out really good in Saul's eyes and then very, very quickly drops off. That's what I wrote down for that. Did anybody else have anything different? Matt?
I kind of extended from there, I guess, that verse 11 here, he threw the spear at him twice. In verse 12, it says he's afraid of David. Verse 13, he sent him away to command an army with the idea that he would be killed with the battle.
Yeah.
And then in verse 15, he's fearful all of him. And then in chapter 19, he's telling his son and the servants to kill him. So it's just escalating further and further. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I kind of stopped right there at those verses. But if you keep on extending it, you're right. It just keeps escalating Saul's animosity towards David. Anybody else? Pat?
Well, I was thinking about verse 15, the last part of it, that he was afraid of it. He was afraid of David.
He was afraid of David, yeah. Kim?
I think another thing we have to remember in all of this, that back in chapter 17 and verse 25, David had asked, what will happen to the man who kills Goliath?
Mm-hmm.
And Saul had said that he would give his daughter in marriage,
Yep.
that he would be given great wealth,
Yep.
and that he would be exempt from paying taxes. So David at some point becomes Saul's son-in-law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, leader of army and on all these other things. So it was a very close relationship there because they were family too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Josh, I kind of read something different into the fact. I've read it many times, but this last time I read about him wanting David for a son-in-law, I read it differently. I read it that he wanted to set David up as an enemy, like he was an enemy, to the Philistines and then all around him, so that David would be killed.
That is part that comes after the marriage, and Matt did touch on that, where at some point after Saul's personal assassinations fail, he starts to use the Philistines as a weapon to maybe fulfill that. Now, we're kind of jumping ahead. We'll hold that thought because we're going to get into that here in just a second. We've kind of already spoiled this, but question 7 says, what was Saul's plan to get rid of David, and how did it turn out? Now, we've kind of already mentioned this. You can take this a couple ways. First was Saul's personal attempt to get rid of David, which was, I'm going to throw a spear. Now, if you read that section, actually, let's do that because we haven't covered that part. So in 1 Samuel chapter 18, let's read those verses. 1 Samuel 18, we'll read from verse 10 down to verse 19. It says, now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of his house while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual, and a spear was in Saul's hand. So right there you can imagine as Saul's raving, he's got this spear and he's just shaking it around and he's in a bad mood and he's just walking back and forth ranting, right? That's kind of where he starts at while David's playing to calm him down. And it says in verse 11, then Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. So at some point, this raving, he centers it on David, and it sounds, the implication, at least from my understanding, is that he's thinking, I'm going to kill David, but I'm going to kind of disguise it off as like, I'm mad and I'm just throwing things. And oh my goodness, I hit David. Oh, So like when people are kicking things and throwing things and you just happen to like accidentally hit David. That seems to be what he might have been going for. Now you do see that it says that he tried this twice. What's not really clear to me is if he tried it twice at this particular occasion, or if it's also counting a time in a chapter or two from now when it repeats the same thing. I forget if it's 19 or 20, but there's another point where he throws a spear at David. So I'm not sure if this verse here is saying this happened twice and it's counting the verse that's coming, or if it happened twice on this occasion and then another future instance it happened as well. So 2 to 3 times though, the point is still the same, that Saul tried to kill David by his own hand, right? Now that was Saul's first plan. Then Pat, what you mentioned was that when this fails and he became afraid of David, he makes the plan to use the Philistines, right? So it says in verse 12, now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had left Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as commander of 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. David was successful in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he was very successful, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he would go out to battle and return before them. Then Saul said to David, here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, my hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. But David said to Saul, who am I? Who is my family or my father's family in Israel, that I should be the king's son-in-law? So it came about at that time that Merab, Saul's daughter, was to be given to David, so that she was given instead to Adriel, I'm going to mess this up, the Meholathite, as a wife. So marrying Saul's daughter wasn't really necessarily part of the assassination attempt, so much it was to try and convince David to go out to these dangerous battles. Like, oh, you're such a great guy, here's my daughter, go be a good commander. It was kind of just more of a distraction than anything, I think. But Saul's plan, again, was that he was going to just try and send David out and get him killed in battle, which is really ironic given what happens later with David and Uriah, right? The fact that this kind of history sort of repeats itself. So that's a lot of talking on my part. So I'll pause here for a second. Any thoughts, questions, comments on this part about Saul's plotting? Okay. All right. So then let's go ahead and read through to the end of the chapter here, because really the next question picks up at the very beginning of chapter 19. So starting in verse 20 of chapter 18, it says, this seems like it's Michal. I don't know how to pronounce it. Michael. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. When they informed Saul, the thing was pleasing to him, for Saul thought, I will give her to him, so that she may become a trap for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David, for a second time you may become my son-in-law today. Then Saul commanded his servants, saying, speak to David in secret, saying, behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's really using this as a political marriage, really. So Saul's servants say these words to David. But David said, is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law, since I am only a poor man and insignificant? Then Saul's servants reported to him, saying, these are the words David spoke. Then Saul said, this is what you shall say to David. The king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul plotted to have David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When his servants told these words to David, it pleased David to become the king's son-in-law. So before the time had expired, David set out and went out, and he and his men, and fatally struck 200 men among the Philistines. Then David brought their foreskins, presented all 200 of them to the king, so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal as a wife. When Saul saw and realized that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David. So you can see this pattern is that every time Saul tries to kind of weaken David, he ends up seeing God's favor on him, and it makes Saul even more afraid than what he was before. So Saul's plan is a terrible plan. It's backfiring at every turn. Then the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle, and it happened as often as they went out that David was more successful than all the servants of Saul, so his name was held in high esteem. Finally, we get into chapter 19, and it says, now Saul told his son Jonathan and all his servants to put David to death. So finally, Saul's quit with the indirect plotting, and he's just going straight to issuing an execution order. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. So Jonathan informed David, saying, my father Saul is seeking to put you to death. Now then, please be on your guard in the morning, and stay in a hiding place and conceal yourself. So we'll stop right there for a second. Question 8 says, according to chapter 19, verse 1, to what extent did Saul's hostility towards David grow? He wanted him killed, and he was pretty much done with the pretense of it, right? There was no more trying to thinly veil the threats or anything. It was just flat out, nope, I want him dead now. And I'm making it a king's order, and that's just what it is, you know? There's no disguising it. And what did Jonathan do in response to this hostility?
He told David to hide because his father wanted to kill him.
Yeah, he told David to hide. He informed David about it. This is a big deal, right? Think about the culture at that time, right? Your father was not someone you were supposed to defy. That's someone you're supposed to follow. Not only that, but this is also the king of Israel, right? God's anointed, right? David makes mention to that multiple times about how he can't attack Saul because this is the king. This is God's anointed. God picked him. That means something to people, or it should mean something. Even when Saul's acting wrongly, it's still important to note that God picked him to lead that country. So for Jonathan to go against this is a big deal, and it really does speak to the great love he had for David. Let's see. Anybody else have any thoughts on that section? Okay. So continuing on a little bit there, we'll read a little bit further. Jonathan, still speaking, says, "And as for me, I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are hiding, and I will speak with my father about you, and whatever I find out, I will tell you." So Jonathan's going to try and walk his father back a little bit, talk some reason to him. Then Jonathan spoke well of David to his father Saul and said to him, "May the king not sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. For he took his life in his hand and struck the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great victory for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then would you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death for no reason?" Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, "As the Lord lives, David shall not be put to death." Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. So everyone kind of made nice. Everything's back to the way it was. Jonathan was able to walk back Saul's anger. When there was war again, David went out and fought the Philistines and defeated them with great slaughter. So they fled from him. Now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp in his hand. So this is the other time that I was mentioning. And in verse 10 it says, "And Saul tried to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he escaped from Saul's presence, so that he stuck the spear into the wall. And David fled and escaped that night. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, informed him, saying, 'If you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death.' So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. And Michal took the household idol and laid it on the bed, and put a quilt of goat's hair at its head, and covered it with clothing. When Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, 'He is sick.' Then Saul sent messengers to David, saying, to see David, saying, 'Bring him up to me on his bed, so that I may put him to death.' When the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was on the bed with the quilt of goat's hair at its head. So Saul said to Michal, 'Why have you betrayed me like this, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped?' And Michal said to Saul, 'He said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death?' So, question 10. Who was Michal, and how did she help David escape from Saul? I think we all know the first part. That was David's wife, right? That was Saul's daughter, not the oldest, right? So we know who Michal is. Now, how she helped David escape here?
Let it down from the window.
This is some real Mission Impossible stuff, right? No, this, to me, it's, I know it's a serious matter, but it really does seem quite comical. You know, it's like a Disney movie where they stuff some pillows under the bed and, you know, a mop as hair or whatever, and they have the sheets as rope. That's really what it sounds like, because she took an idol, which I think it's interesting that they mentioned there's a household idol. You wouldn't think that Saul would have that. He certainly shouldn't have that in there, right? So it's interesting to see that it's another sign of Saul's corruption. She takes the idol, puts it in the bed, puts some goat's hair at the top, and that's supposed to be David, right? And so that fools the servants. So maybe they wanted David to escape, and they weren't really looking too hard either. And then she lets him down. So that's kind of their clever.
Maybe that's why God left Saul, if he had idols like that.
Could be. I mean, you know, if
He's a jealous God, so yes.
if Saul was permitted to have those idols, you know, if God tolerated that for a moment so that he could use that in this way against Saul as kind of a punishment, that's possible. But if there were no idols in the house, she would have found something else. David would have escaped some other way, because clearly God wanted to protect him. So, Pat?
My version says an image. It didn't say idol.
An image? I mean, what would an image be
I don't know.
in there? Right? Think about those times. And like, so an image, a statue, a carving, this is what they're getting at. I suppose if this translation of idol is incorrect and it was just a regular statue as decoration, that could be a possibility. Mine seems to indicate that it was an idol. So I don't know what the Hebrew word is here. Rick, Matt, Rick, and then Matt.
Okay. In the Amplified, the Hebrew word teraphim is the usual one referred to for household idols. They admit that it could have been some other image just that they had, but
Right.
that they are using the usual word that would refer to household idols.
Is that what you were going
I
to
was gonna
say?
say the same thing. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just a confusing word. So idol or
Right.
it's more understandable, but
Right.
we don't want to miss the point about the idol.
Yeah, and I mean, so this is a challenge. This is one reason that we read our Bible so diligently, is the fact that you have to remember this isn't some malicious mistranslation of the Bible. It's that Hebrew is not the same language as English, and they have words that we don't, right? And so when you find a word in Hebrew, you're trying to translate what it means, what the spirit of that word means, but also be as literal as possible because you don't want to change God's word, right? So let me give you a great example of that. You read several times in the Bible where, it says, gird up your loins, right? If you look up what that means, that's the literal translation of what it means. They're actually getting their robes up and getting their robes out of the way so that they could work or fight battles, right? That's what the term means, and it explains it well. The way it's used in context is what we might say today as roll up your sleeves, right? So we have a phrase that it's not the exact translation because we don't wear robes, right? So we don't have that translation. We do wear shirts, and our equivalent of that phrase, of the same idea of get ready to work, get your clothes ready, is roll up your sleeves. They can't translate it as roll up your sleeves because it's not what it says, right? So you have this balance of how literal do I be versus am I getting across the point to the reader in their native language? So it's a balancing act that translators of the Bible have to follow, and it's very tough. So when we read this, that's why you come up with these different translations, and it's very good to look at the different translations of the Bible so you can get a really good feel of what the author is really trying to go after here. So when mine says household idol and Pat says an image, you can kind of get together what the Hebrew author is really trying to get across to you. And unfortunately with that, we're out of time. We can certainly pick up there next week if we want to discuss that further, if you have any more questions. So thank you all for your attention tonight, and we'll pick up there next week.
In a moment, we'll sing I Surrender All, 332. I was thinking about some things we studied in our lesson. That reference in question number 5, where we went back to 1 Samuel 13:14, where Saul had sinfully offered the burnt offerings, and that wasn't his role to do that. And that's when he got in trouble with Samuel, telling him the message from the Lord that the kingdom's being taken from him. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, is where it says there. Of course, that's a reference to David. It sought out a man after his own heart and commanded him to be prince or leader over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And we could arguably say that Saul never surrendered to God. There were moments where he would say the right thing, but if you look at the arc of his life, he's after David, even though the Lord's plan is for David, and he's clearly was told this, but he never surrendered to that plan. And in contrast to that, we could say that David, as it says in the verse we just read, that he's a man after God's own heart. And that David has been trusting God in our study, as we looked last time about David killing Goliath through the power of God, and being a successful soldier and commander, and the Lord was with him. He faced every challenge. And through all that, he respects Saul. And of course, there's going to be more to that as we study through too. Even though Saul is clearly trying to kill him, David won't kill Saul, God's anointed, even when he has the opportunity to do so. David respects God's plan. David is surrendering to God. He's a man after God's own heart. He loves the Lord. He trusts the Lord. He obeys the Lord, and he has a humble spirit. And so the application for us, that we need to surrender to the will of God and be a man after God's own heart in the style of David. David wasn't perfect, but we're not either. But we need to have that right attitude. We need to have that same spirit, repenting of our sins and obeying God. So if there are any things you need to do to obey the gospel, or as members of the church, maybe some things you've fallen away, you want the prayers of the church, we would invite you to come as we stand and sing this song together, 332. I surrender all.